This is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything, but your models aren't based on everything.
In response to Ireland's plan to reduce a cattle herd, Musk dismissively said, killing some cows doesn't matter for the climate. Now, animal agriculture is responsible for more global warming than the entire transportation industry.
Climate change is a dividing issue. For the sake of letting you make your own decision, this video is simply putting together all of the information that's out there. And this may lead you to your own conclusion, or it will probably leave you even more confused. I figured the best way to kick off this video is by open-mindedly look at and listening to all opposing arguments. Okay, so there are 5 really good arguments that I want to talk about. 5. Now, number 1, the main argument made by climate deniers is it's a natural cycle. Now, this visual by NASA shows us how much ice has melted from September of 1984 to September of 2016. This is significant because rather than a short 3 to 5 year span, we're talking a 32-year span that shows our north ice cap significantly decreasing. Now, I realize this is a computer model, and something about computer models makes people not trust whatever is being sold to them. Totally understand. Computer models, well, are man-made and can easily be manipulated. So in case you don't trust it, this other video is provided by Extreme Ice Survey, which is a network of time-lapse camera recordings independent of NASA. Now, this time-lapse was taken from the Columbia Glacier in Alaska from May to August of 2007. The falling of glaciers falling into the ocean is called calving. And although a natural process, warmer temperatures can cause the ice shelves to thin, the ground lines to retreat, and the glaciers to accelerate. Now, if you look to the right, you can see a bit of a bubble on the right side, which means the glacier is unstable and eventually crashes down. Now, this is significant because at a whopping 325 feet tall, this is basically the size of, think, a 32-foot skyscraper in a metropolitan area. This glacier was easy to break because it's connected to the ground on bedrock that goes all the way down a couple thousand feet, and it still broke off. Not in a couple pieces, but as a giant piece, one giant piece. The wobbling of the iceberg is believed to be caused by warmer temperatures that weakened the ice. Now, calving with glaciers as big as this can also contribute to sea level rise. When I found this video that I'm going to show you, it blew me away and is a very important piece of information.
When people say we don't believe in global warming, I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
A few years ago, if you would ask me, I would tell you it's CO2. Why? Because just like everyone else in the public, I listened to what the media had to say.
We definitely have some digging to do. But first, let's move on to the next argument. Now, at number 2, another popular counter-argument is it used to be global cooling. And it's totally true. Before the widespread recognition of global warming, there was a period in the 1970s when concerns about global cooling were discussed. Press reports were released on continued cooling after the release of some academic papers, and this led to public discourse. Why? Because the job of the media is to come up with a good story, and being as trusting as people were back in the day, everyone went along with it. Like any major subject being studied, it had to be broken down into parts, and for climate change, we had climate scientists for aerosols, number 2 being global temperature, number 3 being greenhouse gases, and number 4 being geology. Now, the idea of global cooling came from the group of scientists that were studying aerosols, which are, if you can kind of think of, small particles that occur naturally or are emitted by humans in the air, similar to greenhouse gases, and they have a cooling effect. Now, in this case, it was believed that human activity was increasing the number of aerosols in the atmosphere. But when looking at this graph over the years, there were just a few papers being published on the subject, and there's many more sources that prove the same thing. Overall, the scientific consensus was a belief in global warming over global cooling. What I found out was that scientists later came out and said that they were wrong about global cooling and had actually overestimated the amount of aerosols. So while yes, there were discussions about cooling, global warming was the dominant belief, regardless of some saying otherwise. Number 3 is distrust in science and the government. Now, history has made some people lose trust in science. This is understandable. The scientists have held many different beliefs when it comes to a variety of topics, and sometimes they change their own opinion, which throws people off. Okay, we'll give that to you. But what about government distrust? Now, unfortunately, the government has been no better. If you've watched any of my videos or just paid attention to history, you know that scientists and government have actually partaken in corruption together. People who have this mistrust are going to be the hardest to persuade in believing in climate change. But also, many people working in fossil fuel sectors are going to have a little bit of a bias against climate change. Obviously, clean energy and the elimination of digging holes into the earth could cost them their jobs. Now, if one's trust is that great, trusting any form of data, information, or even consensus is going to be a challenge and may never happen if in fact climate change is real. Now, the film The Great Global Warming Swindle is a great example of this. Number 4, it's the sun. This comes from a scientific belief that the number of sunspots on the sun are a direct correlation to temperature. Now, the more sunspots, the higher the temperature. Apparently, sunspots are believed to cause solar wind. Solar wind prevents cosmic rays from reaching the Earth. Fewer cosmic rays means fewer clouds, and fewer clouds means more heat. Now, this is what some believe to be the cause of climate change, or as they would say, climate cycles. Now, it was hard for me to find any data backing this up or any graphs for that matter. It seemed that this was being talked about around 15 or 20 years ago. However, NASA says that if the sun were responsible for global warming, we would expect to see warming throughout all layers of the atmosphere. However, observations from satellites and weather balloons show warming in the lower atmosphere and cooling in the upper stratosphere, which isn't consistent since the sun is closer. Now, this is also consistent with the warming being caused by a buildup of heat-trapping gases near Earth's surface. Temperatures fell from 1940 to 1975 because air pollution was dimming the sun. Now, solar energy output does affect global temperature, and it made a clear contribution to global warming up until 50 years ago. That temperature spike afterward can't be explained by a change in the solar energy output alone. Now, as you can see in this graph below, solar output hasn't been trending upward since 1978. And finally, the fifth argument is, how reliable are climate models? A common argument heard is, scientists can't even predict the weather next week. How can they predict the climate years from now? Now, this is where people make the mistake. Comparing weather in the short term to climate, which is weather averaged out over a long period of time, is inaccurate. Now, while you can't predict whether a coin will land heads or tails, you can predict the statistical result of a large number, as this is a lot more simple to deal with than the latter. Now, another common misconception is that climate models are biased towards exaggerating the effects from CO2. So, is that true? Do the models consistently overestimate the warming effects of greenhouse gases like CO2? As a recent study suggests, the answer is no. While many models didn't predict the relatively modest surface warming, it's not because they are biased in favor of greenhouse gas emissions, but that these computer simulations just struggle to predict more short-term changes, as we stated earlier. In fact, many of the IPCC predictions have subsequently been shown to underestimate the climate response. Satellite and tide gauge measurements show that sea level rise is accelerating faster than IPCC predictions. Now, the average rate of rise for 1993 to 2008 are measured from satellite is 3.4 millimeters per year, while the IPCC report's best estimate was 1.9 millimeters per year for the same period. Now, observations are tracking along the upper range of IPCC level projections. While they are not without uncertainties, they have demonstrated an accuracy in reproducing past temperatures and predicting various climate phenomena. Now, ongoing research and refinement of models do contribute and increase in the accuracy and usefulness. But before we keep going, hi, my name is Kim and welcome to the Green Lab Coat. If you enjoy living a healthy lifestyle backed by science, make sure to subscribe and don't forget to hit the like button to help the algorithm and the bell to help save the world one human and animal at a time. Let's get started. A lot of these arguments are valid, yet there's one very important question to be answered that will reveal a lot. Climate change nowadays is referring to humankind being responsible for global warming and releasing mostly CO2. However, some people don't believe that it's CO2. So, have humankind exacerbated climate cycles by releasing large amount of greenhouse gases? Well, one reason that this may be true is because population growth is parallel to increased consumption. Now, with 8 billion people alive, increased consumption means increased production, which means more natural resources being taken, many of which take a very long time to grow back. The rich release far more greenhouse gases than the poor, but even the average person is releasing a lot. Think airplanes, cars, boats, and more warehouses to produce for more people. Now, all of this meat demand also means more animal impregnation, so in turn, this results as more livestock than ever before as well. Although people argue that feeding livestock corn and soy takes away from humans, a staggering 86% of global livestock feed consists of materials that are actually inedible to humans. And this is things like crop residues, including sugarcane tops. Now, going back to human population, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we mentioned earlier is the IPCC, specifically identified high population growth as an impediment to limiting global warming. Now, this graph shows us that as our population increased, so has carbon dioxide, and this is a big factor. Now, the UN projects that without further action to address population growth, there will be 2 billion more people by 2050. And 3.5 billion people more by 2100.
Few things annoy me more than to hear people talking about carbon dioxide as being a pollutant. You're made of carbon dioxide. I'm made of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is how living things grow.
Now, rising CO2 concentrations from human activity have been detectably driving up global temperature for just the last 50 years. Burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, transportation, and more are blamed for the production of CO2. Now, this graph also shows us that CO2 goes up and down in sync with temperature. Now, some people believe this graph, while other people believe that CO2 has hardly anything to do with it, as we've mentioned a couple times already. Now, climate deniers say that temperature is affected by more factors than just CO2, and this is true, but they also say that no correlation that's consistent exists. A WWF UK article clarifies that CO2 itself does not cause problems and is part of the natural global ecosystem, but the issue lies in the quantity of CO2 being produced by human activities, and this doesn't take into account other greenhouse gases. So yes, water vapor is the most abundant greenhouse gas, but when temperatures increase due to higher CO2 concentrations, the atmosphere becomes more humid, thus amplifying the global warming effect. Now, to be clear, the world should not be without CO2, but this is telling that human activity is to blame. Unless we can come up with a better answer to that, it does sound pretty valid. Now, we're going to cover a little bit of history as we usually do on this channel. We're going to rewind back in time to see if we can see some patterns here. Now, we can trace the present warming trends to at least 100 years to a time with a cold spell, also known as Little Ice Age. Now, around this time, and even after, there were talks of ice fairs and ice skating going on, pointing to the fact that, despite the extreme cold, people seemed fine. If you guessed that this was said by climate deniers, you were right. Now, if we look back further in time, before the Little Ice Age, there was a golden era where temperatures were supposedly warmer than they are today. Climatologists knew this era as the medieval warm period, but people didn't view it as apocalyptic. Instead, they built cathedrals and vineyards, and based off that, some guessed they were flourishing and unbothered by the heat, which, you have to admit, air conditioning and modern conveniences would in fact make warmer temperatures uncomfortable for people in this era. Now, if we look back even further, we find more warm spells for prolonged periods during a period geologists know as the Holocene maximum, and this is a particularly important one. People on both sides of the argument view this as a good and even wonderful time, but the temperature is where the disagreement lies. Now, some say temperatures were significantly higher than they are now and that they were so for more than 3 millennia. So, quick reminder, a millennia is 1,000 years, not 100. Now, according to multiple sources, the first polar bears can be traced back to 150,000 years ago, and 5,915 polar bear bones were received from the Holocene maximum era. Are polar bears resilient enough to withstand temperatures of high heat? If so, the argument that they can adapt may very much be valid. Now, polar bears have shown resilience and adaptability throughout their evolutionary history, but the Holocene maximum provided polar bears with a longer period of time to adapt. 3 millennia is a long time. Apparently, the warming trends observed in recent decades are occurring at a much faster rate than historical climate changes. So while polar bears have demonstrated resilience in the past, they are reportedly facing significant challenges due to loss of sea ice in the Arctic that is ongoing at a rapid pace. So let's keep moving. After the First World War, the industrial era began. But after the Second World War, the industrial era was absolutely booming. From the perspective of climate deniers, temperatures should have increased given all the new inventions and creations. But temperatures went down during the year of 1945, when the war ended and kept falling for 4 decades until 1975. Now, this is totally valid. Why weren't temperatures rising when coal, iron, and machinery were being utilized and built at a more rapid pace? Now, this goes back to the release of aerosols, which we talked about earlier. Although solar activity did play a role, so much aerosols were being released into the air at the time, which have a cooling effect, that they overpowered solar energy and temperatures went down. Now, this was referred to as the cooling trend or global dimming, and this is because the pollution also caused a reduction in sunlight that was reaching Earth's surface. Now, CO2 levels were also not that significant at that time, so because of this, climate deniers believe CO2 has nothing to do with it. While CO2 probably wasn't a big factor during that time, climate scientists claim that this changed during the Industrial Revolution, where we passed 350 parts per million in 1988. Now, climate deniers point out that volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than factories, cars, and human-made things combined. Nature naturally brings CO2 levels up to 280 parts per million, but that's the limit, and then it goes back down again. But as of May 2022, the current global average of CO2 in the atmosphere is 421 parts per million. So while nature does provide some of that CO2, what's to blame for the increase in droughts, heat waves, floods, forest fires, etc.? Additionally, the ocean is a big carbon sink, and it has stored incredible amounts of CO2 over the years. But it's no secret now that the ocean waters have become more acidic than alkaline, which is an indicator that something's wrong. Now, too much CO2 is believed to be changing the chemistry of the ocean. In fact, new observations by the Carbon Brief believe that more CO2 is being absorbed than previously thought. Now, this in turn affects marine life. Absolutely everything is connected. Now, when it comes to the general consensus, and this responds to the mistrust that many people have towards science. While there are a lot of scientists who don't believe in climate change, the vast majority of actively publishing climate scientists agree that humans are causing it and that the consensus is no way split down the middle. It's also not a topic that scientists are confused, divided, or all over the place on as far as opinions. Matter of fact is that it's a strong opinion, and more so as time went on than in the past. Now, a 2013 study published in Environmental Research Letters found that 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. And similarly, another 2021 study published found that greater than 99% of peer-reviewed scientific literature on climate change agrees that humans are causing global warming. In 1999, when the hockey stick graph came out, authors were pretty clear of the uncertainty, and lawsuits were filed against them as some felt that the graph wasn't a hockey stick. So now there was a battle between two graphs. This one belongs to climate believers, and this one belongs to climate deniers. Now, if the Holocene maximum era was as hot as climate deniers say it was, the beginning of the hockey stick graph should be more curved, and the Ice Age era should have been present in the graph as well. Now, years later, many more studies would come confirming the accuracy of the hockey stick graph over the other one. So while the hockey stick graph has been the subject of controversy, the scientific consensus is that it is an accurate depiction of climate change, especially over the other one. Now, another consensus is that of the medieval times. While some describe the Holocene maximum as the warmest era, it's believed that it was overestimated and that temperatures were in fact not as warm as documentaries like The Great Global Warming Swindle made the era out to be. Now, aside from that, it's believed to have been happening regionally rather than globally. Now, one thing that is true is that In this day and age, we have advances that have allowed scientists to be more clear on the matter. Most believe the observed global warming over the past 50 years or so cannot be explained by natural causes and instead requires a significant role for the influence of human activities. So while, yes, there were more scientists back in the day who didn't believe in climate change, it turns out many of them have actually came to the other side. The geographical range where birds live has also changed, and some birds are moving higher into elevated latitudes in search of suitable habitats. But it's not just that. Timing of when birds usually migrate has also changed. This means that birds are either migrating earlier or delaying their transitions to when the weather allows. Now, the very unfortunate thing about this is that whenever these flocks of birds reach their destination, it actually affects their ability to find food. Now, the other thing that's no longer guaranteed is suitable breeding grounds. Climate change can actually disrupt the time of egg laying. So they're not just dying due to scarcity in food, but due to not reproducing also. And likewise, bees are also migrating to cooler areas and also believed to be because of climate change. Now, this is affecting their pollen availability and therefore reducing the number of plants getting pollinated. As an indirect result, this affects our food supply and agriculture activity. Now, apart from that, trees are blossoming early. This causes trees to be mismatched with their pollinators, in turn affecting the survival for both. Now, early blooms can also be threatened by late freezes, which can damage or kill the flowers. And finally, we touched on rapid increases in disastrous events earlier, as well as the acidity of the ocean. And it turns out the factor that best predicts storm intensity is sea surface temperature. The warmer the seas, the stronger the storms. Here's one take on it. Whether it's true or whether it isn't true, there's a lot of credibility here. Now, living and growing up in California, I can remember a time when California had a lot more spare land, houses were more spread apart, and nature was more preserved, and we coexisted with wide open spaces. Now, if any person doesn't think climate change is real, this should not be an invitation by any means to keep encouraging the complete takeover of nature, massive construction of suburban neighborhoods as we already have enough, or supporting big corporations that buy out homes in return for a hefty profit when millions can't compete with buying one, and then more have to be made. If ever a time came where all land was gone and the ground is occupied by nothing more than buildings and things alike, let us not forget that as human beings, we can't be truly happy without good old Mother Nature in existence and right in our backyard. Now, no matter your take, preserving our planet and keeping it healthy is our responsibility. Now, you can support the movement by doing these 3 things: planting more trees, cutting out as much waste as possible, and then probably the hardest by far is adopting a plant-based diet so as to fix the animal agriculture problem. In the end, the choice is yours.